All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is Randy Seidel, and this is a podcast brought to you by Sales Community and the Alexander Group. Alexander Group, I've recently come to have known of them, but just kind of firsthand, really within the past month, and just really fantastic tier one in terms of compensation, advice, feedback, and kind of as I was just saying, you kind of think compensation is kind of one layer, but you're going to find, I think, through this, you can really peel it back several layers. And we're fortunate enough to have all-star CRO Brandon Sweeney with us. Brandon, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Randy. How are you doing today?
Excellent. Thank you. Maybe you could give us a little background. You've worked with Alexander Group for a while and are pretty passionate about this topic.
Yeah, no, thanks, Randy, and good to be with everyone today. So I have my background's VMware for 16 years and a variety of different roles in the Americas and then globally, then here at HashiCorp for now, 7 quarters, and work with AGI both at VMware and also at HashiCorp. And you know, the punchline here, compensation drives all behavior. You know, you want to get it right. And AGI has been a great lever and source of truth for how things are really happening in the field and at other companies to drive transformation around comp plans, both at large scale, both at VMware and clearly at Hashi. So great topic and a lot of depth to the topic, I'm sure later today.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for joining us. And we also have Ted Grossman and Rachel Parrinello from Alexander Group. So welcome, Ted and Rachel.
Nice to meet you.
And it's amazing. We're talking that I guess Ted, you're 16 years there, and Rachel 24. So Rachel, you must have started in compensation when you were 14, 15 years old.
Exactly, my passion when I was a teen.
That's great. So we're going to encourage everybody to ask questions if you can. If you are, there's several of you, so it's hard to see. So you can kind of raise your hand or just kind of chime in with the voiceover. We definitely want this to be interactive. You can also post questions in the chat, and Brandon and I will be chiming in here and there. So Ted, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks everybody. I thought we'll do just a minute or two on AGI and a framework that we have, and then we'll get into the actual topics just to set context. AGI is a management consulting firm, been around about 35 years now. We call ourselves revenue growth consultants, so all go to market, whether that's working on strategic things like, segmentation and coverage models, how you organize your people and your internally, how you use channels, what kind of jobs you have, which we'll be talking about a lot, and then how does that then translate into things like how do you deploy people, how do you invest in talent, how do you think about the metrics for measuring your business, the growth of your business, and then finally, how do you then compensate and motivate and performance manage people to hit the goals. Those are all the types of things that we work on. We have a lot of research that we do that supports that. And specifically within the tech industry, which we're divided by industry sectors, tech represents about 35 to 40% of our business. It's our largest vertical. We do about 150 projects a year. About half of those are actually compensation projects. So we're really well known in the compensation. I think we're considered sort of the leading firm there. Within the go-to-market, we drive a lot of business and sort of upstream from that, the compensation as well. So one of the frameworks I wanted to just share with you, and I was kind of talking about this in strategy, structure, management. We call this our revenue growth model. The key here is when we started the business 35 years ago, our company was focused on sales compensation. In fact, we were the first sales compensation firm out there. There were people who there were HR firms, and they had little compensation arms, but they didn't necessarily do sales compensation, or they just a small piece of it. It was not very long. If you know anything about compensation, it's all about what Brandon was talking about. It's about behaviors and jobs. And so we understand the jobs, then you're going to do very well in setting good compensation plans. But in order to align the jobs, you really have to start thinking about sales process. You have to think about your coverage models. You have to think about the kinds of value propositions people are going to be talking about, and even what kinds of segments are you talking into. So you kind of full suite. We got good at doing all of these things: strategy, structure, and management. But that's where you can see where how the compensation sort of fits into the overall process, which is why we're here to talk about today. So with that, what we thought we would do is, if you can go to the next slide, was talk a little bit about some of the major trends that are happening in the industry. I lead our tech industry practice. Rachel is our, while we all do a lot of compensation, she's our SME of SMEs within the compensation world. And so she's going to sort of lead the conversation on sales comp issues specifically. I'm going to sort of set the stage with talking about some of these industry trends. And what I'm really going to be doing here is talking about the things that we see from our clients and our prospects. What are the kinds of issues and things that are popping up most? And we're going to sort of select the ones that are probably affecting the root cause behind a lot of issues or things that people want to talk about in compensation. So first one, we want to talk a little bit about some of these market trends. I'm going to select 2 or 3 of these that seem to be hot topics right now. But you can see there's a whole number of different things on here that cause people to reach out to us or focus on various go-to-market challenges that they're having. One thing that's been popping up is, we work mostly with companies that sell software. Sometimes they sell hardware, software, and services, all 3 of those. The move to X as a service, to software, to SaaS and subscription models in particular has been happening over the last 10 or 15 years. And I'd say it's pretty far along. So most companies now have term licenses that they're doing, and they're selling in that way versus selling on perpetual. There are still some companies that are converting over. We call them hybrid companies. But the real exciting area is consumption. I think as companies have gotten used to, as customers have gotten used to purchasing as a service, they're saying, wait, I can really align my operating expense to how I'm using the software, what kind of value I'm trying to get out of that. And that's leading to a drive both from a customer perspective to want to purchase on consumption. So we're seeing a lot of companies starting to offer up consumption pricing. And that leads to a lot of complexity from an operational perspective and from a compensation perspective, which we'll get into shortly. I know, Brandon, this is something that I think you're dealing with right now a little bit as well, and it's going to be a journey. I think it's.
Yeah, no, I think you've been helping us a little bit on this, Ted. I think we're largely a self-managed on-prem business transitioning to cloud, but then what that means in terms of both infrastructure, your billing systems, then ultimately driving the right behavior around consumption across all of the different types of sellers, from pre-sales through customer success managers and renewals managers. So that to me is the trick of how do you drive alignment across all those different motions with the different personalities or functions to drive that consumption, because you get it right and good things happen.
Yeah. And I'll also say, I think as you go, this is really an evolution from perpetual to subscription to consumption. When you're in the middle of it, you have your existing business, which is still on term, and then you're offering this new consumption model up. So how do you avoid unintended consequences like drops in revenue, or actually get the right results that you want from a revenue gen perspective?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I actually, just on that point, I think it's how you then deploy the consumption comp plan and the model based upon your infrastructure maturity. And that's I think the trick, so you don't have a hiccup.
Yep.
Yeah. A lot of companies are having to pay for migrations as if it's new bookings because it requires that much persuasion.
Yeah. Do you find often that you have kind of CFOs who, kind of are used to the perpetual, which is obviously, it might be, kind of 10x the ARR or 5x the ARR. And then when it comes time to paying on the consumption or ARR, MRR model, they're kind of not wanting to pay kind of what would be appropriate?
I think, if initially in the early days of moving towards X as a service, there was a lot of resistance to that. Real concern, like, oh, we're going to have a big drop in revenue, and really the discussion becomes one of total contract value versus, or a perpetual license where you get it all up front versus paying on the first year. What I see is, as the markets have moved and customers have liked this model, it also, recurring revenue has become king in the eyes of anybody who's doing valuation. So whether that's the Wall Street or whether that's PE firms, they're kind of like saying, I want to see growth in net recurring revenue. And if you can show me that, I'm going to give you a high valuation. So there's been more, I think, acceptance of it amongst the CFO community than there has been before. The consumption one is a new challenge because while that still could be revenue, it really needs to be predictable revenue. And so I think as consumption models come out, there's a large discussion on how predictable will that revenue be, and are we going to be paying people on it up front if we don't know exactly what, how they're going to use it or how much they're going to consume.
Hey, Ted, Larry Irvin, quick question for you on that. So, as Brandon kind of alluded to, obviously comp plans are, designed to drive behavior, but also the art is around keeping it simple. Mm-hmm. And, that's where I sort of see, the consumption models and even based on subscription and, if you have a downgrade and backfilling the ARR on the renewal and then you go to a consumption, it's starting to get really complex. I'd love to hear you guys kind of talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to get through some of these key topics, but consumption will be one of the big rock issues that we're going to talk about from a comp perspective. And so if you can just hold on for about 5-10 minutes, we'll get into, we'll come back to that topic if that's okay.
Beautiful, thanks.
Okay. Other things that we're seeing that are sort of front and center, new ecosystems and routes to market. It used to be if you were a software vendor or you had a value-added reseller, maybe there's some GSIs out there or some system integrators that you dealt with to help influence revenue. But frankly, it was a fairly simple ecosystem. Now customers are buying complete solutions from managed service providers. So you might not even know who your customer is, and you're selling to the managed service provider who then sells it on to the customer. It might be being sold by, hey, your product is embedded in somebody else's software, so you're like an ISV to somebody else, and it's like an OEM relationship. It might be the traditional VARs, but the VARs are now offering a lot of add-on services and subscription services to get their own recurring revenue up so they can get higher valuations. So the ecosystem and what I would say the partner types that are out there, how you're structuring your channel organization is getting really complicated as well. This is obviously having big impacts on channel programs, but if you think about the back end and who internally in your company, whether it's direct reps or channel reps, are involved in persuading customers or driving revenue, it has big impacts in terms of, okay, how do you pay? And one of the big questions we always get is, we want to make sure that we're not paying 50 people on this deal. Well, I got an alliance involved. I got a GSI involved. I have a managed service provider involved. Oh, and by the way, the sales rep will always say that they were talking to the customer first. So, how do you handle all those kinds of situations?
Yeah, and the only thing I'd extend on that, Ted, is obviously with marketplaces from the big three taking on more and more prevalence in terms of funding, right? Grabbing EDP dollars. That's something to think through. And then the other piece, at least what we're seeing, is as we move to a consumption model or really focusing on net dollar expansion, how do we incent our partners on the renewal and how will we comp them? And so we're spending a lot of time trying to make sure we'll pay you a bunch of money if it's accretive to our net dollar expansion, right? Versus just a consistent, payout over term. So there's a lot of discussions to think about around comp, not just for your direct badged employees, but your ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the big three because I sort of left that out. But Amazon, Azure, and Google are, at least in North America, are completely changing the world right now, and they have consumption models. And so a lot of companies are trying to sort of snap to their model. So that it's easier to work with them and that they can generate revenue the same way, but it doesn't always work. So that's a big discussion.
And Ted, partners are not just classified in one little bucket like they used to be in the past, right? VARs can also be service providers. Your alliance partners can also be resellers, right? So that's also a challenge there.
Yeah.
And then, and so Andy said at some point, can you talk on commission structure around renewals, extensions versus net new logos? So I think you had that coming up, correct?
Yep.
And then Kaylin said, what comp structures would you suggest with consumption-based billing models when it comes to booking versus realized? If you want to tackle that now, or if that's coming up.
Yeah, I think we're going to hit all those things in the compensation part. I'm going to go really fast because I can tell everybody's really itching to talk about compensation, and this setup now is becoming a little laborious. But I think this last one, I kind of have to hit on it because we are getting more incoming than ever in terms of how to attract and retain the best talent. And as we've come out of the pandemic, or maybe we're still in it, but the economic recovery and the growth that we're seeing within the tech industry is huge, and everybody is trying to go for the best talent. It's just very, very difficult. So this has big impacts on, well, how are we going to handle that? Are we going to handle that through compensation, stock and sales compensation of some sort? Or does that become a broader topic that includes, we need to rethink about our career paths. We need to really think of and how we show a long-term vision for customers. How do we, our employees, how do we affect our culture to make it a wonderful place to work? How does this impact, what do we have to give them to ensure that they're going to be talented, that they're going to hit their goals from a lead gen perspective and so forth. So there is I think this one, I like to put it in, it's compensation, but it's really performance management. And it's a topic we're getting hit on all the time. So I think these three right now represent, while there's always change going on in tech, these are three of the really big ones that we're seeing the most often. This is quickly, and I'm just going to kind of hit for a second so we can get to the comp stuff, leading to a number of internal initiatives and things that are sort of related to these trends. Solution evolution. One of the things that we saw as people moved to SaaS over the last few years is there was a lot of born in the cloud companies that had a single solution or a single product, and they're building out their platforms. And this kind of goes to the idea that everybody is looking for, and customers are looking really for integrated solutions, and hopefully from, single sources if they can. So, companies now have multiple products that they might sell on their platform. And how do you get the cross-sell working? How do you make sure that you're really selling, at a higher level to higher level execs and getting the whole story and all the offerings that you have in your company moving forward? This is probably continuously happening, but it seems to be just a lot of companies are now graduating to scale in the tech industry that, they might have been $100 million companies a few years ago, but now they're $500 million companies or $1 billion. And it's a big challenge for them. Second one here that I kind of wanted to focus on was, you can hit the button, Rachel, is, customer success. And this is, wow. We probably get more questions on this and more activity and projects around customer success in the last year than almost anything when we're talking about coverage models and compensation. There's, if you go back to 2003 or 2002 when customer success was introduced by Salesforce as a role, and it was basically there to help with, hey, we got to make sure our customers are using this so that they'll renew. It turned into an adoption mechanism for most companies, and that's what it still is to this day. But more and more, there's sort of a new phase going on in the industry where customer success organizations are really being seen as a revenue driver, not just for retaining, but also for helping to expand. And people are finding, I'll call them revenue plays or sales plays, where customer success can play a big role, and this is having a big impact on how they fit into our compensation plan. So,
this is a big one for me. Yeah, sorry, Ted, finish your thought.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I really, this one for me has been, I think there's tremendous opportunity on customer success to be a lever for driving net dollar expansion. You figured out how to solve for gross churn, and then you start to build from there. And so I do think the integration of the comp model and the selling motion from pre-sales into post-sales is critically important to scaling the business. And so I think you're spot on. This is a kind of the secret sauce to go build a long-term sustainable business.
Yeah, I mean, just to give some anecdotes, 4 or 5 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, when people would come to us and say, hey, do we need to have a comp plan? Most people were not on comp plans in this role. Starting about 2 years ago, maybe about 25% of companies were doing it. Last year, it was about 50%. I think it's now becoming like almost 60 or 70%. So it's happening because the role of the customer success is changing in the organization, or more roles are popping up. And so again, it's being driven by a change in the coverage model and how customer success is being used. The last one I wanted to hit on was digital and self-service. Clearly, as we've all gone to virtual over the last year, it's just helped drive a process that's been going on for years in the industry, which is how do we get, especially in the lower end of the market, SMB mid-market, but even in the high end of the market, how do we get customers having better access to quick information as quickly as possible? How do we help them serve in a low cost model? And so whether this really has an impact on roles, because it often is not just a pure automated process. There are going to be inside roles, business development roles, people who are there to convert people from freemiums into paid dollars, and how does that all work? And there are companies that are becoming very, very successful in driving huge revenue streams by building up their sort of self-service or assisted service, maybe is the way to do it, coverage models. And so again, it's having a big impact on a whole bunch of new roles that we're starting to see pop up.
Ted, Dave asked, going back on the customer success, curious on customer success, how you deal with hunting versus farming roles, and do you see two different roles?
Yeah, that's we have a whole. So the discussion about whether your account exec is a hunter, a farmer, or what we call a rancher, meaning they're doing both. Most companies still have a lot of ranchers. Okay, where if you look at their territory, they're going to have prospects and they're going to have existing install base. And so, but there are some other companies, especially as you go segment by segment, look at different segments, you'll see that sometimes companies will bifurcate and have separate hunters and farmers. What's interesting about customer success is, if you had, let's say, an AE who was your hunter type of person, then you had an account manager who was your farmer kind of person, would you have a customer success sitting on top of that? And I think what we're starting to see is, sometimes what's happening is you have this rancher role, which is but now you have customer success that's supporting that rancher. Okay. And it's saying, okay, for your install base accounts, what can I be taking on? What kinds of motions do I need to be taking on that's going to help support driving the business up? So I think we're seeing all sorts of variations of just looking at the core sales roles, a rancher role, or a split bifurcated model between AE and AM. But on top of that, we're also seeing customer success as well. And then the question is, what are the activities that the customer success org and roles take on versus what are the activities that the selling role takes on?
We also are seeing lots of different types of customer success roles. So the role up in the upper segment may be completely different than the more programmatic role down, lower down market. We also see more business-oriented customer success roles versus technical, which may actually be in different organizations. And then there's kind of other nuances that we're seeing as well. So yeah. I think I think when we pulled this in one of our recent symposiums, I think on average people had about 2 to 3 customer success roles.
Yeah. Yeah. I noticed you wrote, Dave, affordability modeling is critical then. Well, yeah. I think of customer success as just like any other overlay. The reason you have them is to be accretive to the company, and there has to be an ROI on them, right? So if you can show that productivity as a whole is going up, then that sort of is the ROI and the reason you do it in the first place. what we're finding, and if you go, we actually did some studies on this where we looked at companies that have hit rule of 40, where their growth and their profitability is above 40%. And there's a very, very high correlation to one, those companies have much higher net recurring revenue rates than other companies. So to Brandon's point, that's what everybody's looking for, and they really focus on both growth and net retention in a big way. Secondly, that the companies that are doing that well tend to have pretty highly staffed customer success organizations and more sophisticated customer success organizations. So I'm just sort of saying at a global level, this is where we're seeing the market go. And I think, as I said, different companies are figuring it out a little bit differently, but this is certainly an area of investment.
Yeah, for us, it's been a big area of investment, and just on gross retention and just how that buffers your business. Plus, in a multi-product world, the CSMs and the CSAs, architects, have been enormous levers to drive stickiness and natural expansion. I measure the teams. And one thing I care about the most of almost any metric besides day one pipeline is, are we deploying the foundational use case to the customer where they see the benefits we talked about in the pre-sales success plan? And if that happens, they're going to be very sticky customers, and then the expansion engine takes over. So the CSMs play an important role in that.
And Ted, TJ Napoli here. Just a question on that. So are you seeing a move more towards a customer success manager role being more of a sales role and more non-technical, where traditionally it felt like it was more deployment, right? And technical expertise to help a project getting deployed. Are you seeing opportunity more towards it being really aligned with revenue and, kind of at-risk compensation if
yeah, TJ, the trend is definitely that, but there is a quandary right here, because the whole reason that people have been avoided putting customer success people on plans in the past is you want them to be like trusted advisors. Right. If they come off as a commissioned rep, do they lose the trust of the customer? I think what companies are starting to find is, first of all, they're not going to be as highly leveraged plans. The plans that you do see tend to be 20 or 30% of their OTE at risk, not 50% like you might see with a normal rep. So that's one thing. But secondly, there are ways that they can influence and still maintain trust, very much like a sales engineer. And so not just having them in there saying, let me help you, but let me help you with the idea of how can I provide even more value? How can you get more value out of this? And by the way, there's an offering there. Different companies will then say, well, maybe they don't handle the commercial transaction, but they are certainly involved in helping drive expansion of usage and finding new use cases, or ensuring that the use cases that might have been identified up front are being filled, to Brandon's point. Yeah, it's definitely the trend. Go ahead. So this is all, these were kind of like the topics we wanted to kind of get into, and then we're going to, double click into some of these. I know you have a similar slide, Rachel, with some of the key compensation discussion. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And
so this is all great dialogue, and we'll dive into a lot of your specific questions as we go through this page. So, and this is really our last page to present. So again, welcome the dialogue here. So when we think about the technology industry and, the hot topics that all our clients are wrestling with, we bucketed them into 3 categories. One is aligning the comp plan to various strategic initiatives, which will probably focus most of their time on all of these. So quite a few there. 2 is aligning the comp plan to evolving jobs and the desired behaviors for each of those jobs. So as these companies are going through all these transformations and evolutions of what their coverage model looks like and what the job role is, it's having obviously an impact on how you compensate them. So getting back to Brandon's focus on behaviors. And then lastly, there's sort of all these foundational things that companies need to figure out around various policies and practices and governance and new hires and all those types of things. So we get a lot of questions on that stuff as well. But we're going to focus on, I think, 7 specific areas here. The first one is aligning the compensation plan to ILAIR, which is identify, land, adopt, expand, renew. And I know, Andy, you're asking, like, how do we pay for new versus expansion versus renew? And so first, I want to go back to the statement Ted said, which is, we need to figure out what are our jobs. So a lot of companies will go immediately, or a lot of our clients will go immediately to, hey, I want to pay the seller on renewal, or I don't want to pay the seller on renewal. Well, first of all, we need to figure out who owns the renewal. And if we think about all the different jobs in your ecosystem, how is the course, even if you have a renewal rep, do you want the core seller involved? Yes or no? And that will vary for different companies. And what we typically will ask is that renewal a resell or is it a reorder? Right? So reorder means it's more administrative. We could probably hand it over to a lower cost resource versus resell. And particularly for companies who are going through migrations, that renewal event becomes a migration event. And so it does take a lot of persuasion. And so, yes, we want to pay our core seller on that renewal. Then there becomes the question of, well, is $1 with land and expand, or do we want to pay less for renewals? And we see very different practices here. So some companies will say, you know what, we're in the midst of this migration or our renewal. We have competitive threats going on, and so $1 is $1 for all of our renewals. Some companies will say, you know what, we just take our big top renewals and we plug that into the core rep plan. The ones that are most at threat. But then the rest of the renewals we hand over to the renewal rep. So anyway, those are some solutions. Or you may do something like a credit downlift for the renewals, or you have a separate measure for the renewals. So there's lots of different solutions, and we do see that it varies quite a bit. And then I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Ted said is we do see a lot of companies with a rancher model, meaning that the seller is responsible for land, expand, and renew. And in that case, what we'll see is, how do you differentiate between land and expand? Or even renewal, right? How do we make sure they're constantly landing net new logos? And so the most predominant solution we see there for driving land tends to be some sort of credit uplift or add-on bonus that is in the compensation plan. Sometimes when you go down market, we might see it as a number of new logos, a quantity metric. This is usually in kind of startup high growth companies where they're all about getting market share. It's like, I don't care how big this deal is. Let's just get as many people on our platform as we can. So you may see it as a carve out metric, but not very common. Usually land is measured as some sort of new logo metric or something like that. Now, what other companies will do is they'll actually, peel off and have a very specific role focusing on just landing new logos. But that doesn't seem to be as common as kind of the rancher or the role that's responsible for land and expand. So hopefully that answers your question. I think that was you, Andy. I don't know if you have any follow-up questions on that one.
Yeah, I think he's listed only. So.
All right. Okay. So we'll go on to the next hot topic that we get a lot of questions on, and that is, how should we compensate for our multi-year deals? The predominant solution today, even for hybrid companies, but definitely for the pure play X-as-a-service companies, is to pay on ACV or ARR. Usually those mean the same thing. It's just the first year, or excuse me, the first year value or the average contract value. And so then how do we pay for those multi-years or for driving 2 or 3 year deals? The most predominant solution we see in our database is actually an add-on bonus. And so that's usually expressed as a taking their individual commission rate or BCR, however you define it, and actually taking a fraction of that and paying out an extra bonus based on having a 2-year deal or a 3-year deal.
Yeah.
So that's, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just say this one really gets into the sort of the strategy. Some companies don't. If you have a very sticky type of thing that is, it's hard to rip out. People like it. Your renewal rates are generally very, very, very high. Then, what you don't want to do is have to get multi-year deals with customer. Generally what you do is you offer discounts. And so there's a desire then in that case, probably not to pay a lot on multi-year because it's going to happen anyway. In other cases, maybe you want to be, in other cases, we know the price is going to go up every year. And we want to make sure that we're building in, we're going to maximize the price realization that we're going to get on what we have. Again, another reason not to emphasize multi-year, but sometimes people want to, it's a way of locking your customers in. So I think your solution here and how much you pay on what we call the out years, not the first year, really depends on a lot on your product and your strategy, of course.
Mm-hmm. That being saying, that the most predominant solution is a bonus. Sometimes it's expressed as a credit uplift, tends to be more frequently used in hybrid companies. And then occasionally we will see companies actually peel out a separate measure, a lower weighted measure where they actually give an out year quota and out year pay. Not as frequent as a solution as the bonus is the most predominant solution. The next hot topic is around solution focus. So when you're a smaller one-trick pony company, it's probably not so much an issue for you because that's all you're selling. But when you become a big company, like Brandon, when you're at VMware, right, you're trying to sell across the whole portfolio. And so there tends to be focused products or kind of high strategic products that you're trying to get your sellers to sell or cross-sell, right, into, so this kind of becomes a little bit of an expansion metric. And so there's lots of different solutions here. The most predominant solution we see, again, it depends on the complexity of your product portfolio and how important these strategic solutions are to sell and how maybe different the selling motion is. But we definitely see either some sort of credit uplift, particularly for new products, because it's like trying to get people to kind of do something new, to add on bonuses. And then for real mature companies, we will see them carve out a separate bucket and have that focus on those strategic solutions. And then that kind of dives into topic 4, which is kind of a subtopic of the solution focus, right? It's for those hybrid companies that are moving to as a service, to either moving from perpetual to term licenses, or sometimes we see from maybe even SaaS now we're seeing to consumption. So whenever you're going through these migration, how do you put focus on that? And so while you can use the same type of solutions for a solution focus, meaning it's a bonus or a credit uplift or a separate measure, and even there's the hurdle or the gate, which I haven't spoken about, but that is another option here. But not used as frequently, tends to add too much complexity in the plan and only really impacts your top performers. But the other solution here, number 4, is your crediting rules. So what we used to see is a lot of kind of value uplifts or credit uplifts on your as a service solution vis-a-vis your on-prem, your perpetual solution. But now, since so many companies have migrated to subscription, what we're now seeing is to drive parity or maybe even focus above parity, we're seeing companies take their perpetual solution and divide by 3, or their perpetual solution, I've seen quite a few companies do this, and divide by 4, right? So you still have an ACV quota, but your perpetual solution is divided by 4, so it puts less focus on perpetual and more focus on the subscription, but allows you to have kind of one sort of what I call OpEx quota and crediting system, versus in the old days, it was more of a CapEx quota and crediting system where you would have, the perpetual solution and the TCV of the subscription solution in one bucket. And now we see a one bucket plan where it's the ACV model, and then you translate the perpetual into an ACV. And now we get to, Kaylin, your topic around consumption models. So before we talk about the different solutions here, I will say it really depends on what type of consumption pricing model you have. So what we've identified is there's kind of 4 different types of pricing models out there. There's one which seems to be pretty common for a lot of, particularly the pure play consumption companies, where there is a commit. So you get somebody commit to a term, a year or more, but you also get them to commit to a dollar amount, right? So they're kind of buying a pool of funds, if you will. And so there's still that kind of ACV motion and that commitment, but then you got to get people to consume against it. So very similar to an enterprise license agreement in the old kind of perpetual days. So that's kind of one model. And when we see that model, what we're seeing, particularly for the pure play consumption companies, is you end up with a 2-measure plan. You end up with an ACV metric and you end up with a revenue metric. It's the most predominant solution we've seen, although there are others. I have a client right now who does just 100% revenue. They don't care about the commit. And I have another client that still focuses on just the commit. And then I've also seen 100% revenue with maybe add-on bonuses for the commits. So those are just some options there. Then we get into, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, we even, it's pretty rare, but there's a couple companies who feel so confident in their ability to forecast the predictability that they'll pay on the commit based on a forecast. There's 1 or 2 that are experimenting with that, and they seem to be successful. But that takes a lot of experience of knowing, what's going to come later.
Right. So that would be if you don't have that commit up front, right, Ted?
Yeah.
So
Yes, that's right.
There's that pricing model where you're doing the commit, but then you're doing the consumption. And then there's the next one where you do, you have a contract, but only a partial amount of it's committed. So the customer commits to 100K per year, but then there's maybe you think there's going to be another 100K or more of kind of additional business that comes in. That one becomes quite tricky. Because usually there's a question of whether or not you want to pay on the commit or not. And it depends on how much that commit is as a portion of the overall estimated spend for that customer. So I have one client in the fintech space who they said, our commits are only 50K, but we want them to spend $1 million. So we're not even going to focus on the commit. Whereas other customers might say, hey, you know what, we want to get as much predictability into our system, so we'll pay on the commit, but then they'll pay on the estimated value of the consumption. Their next model, contract model, is there's a contract, but there's no commit whatsoever. So in here, in both Model 2 and Model 3, for that for the part that you don't that is not committed, like Ted said, if you can estimate the value, so some of our fintech clients can, because they go into a bank and they know how many mortgages they do or whatever it might be, they will actually pay on the estimated value. But if you're like most tech companies where you may not be able to estimate that value. And so usually you're you have to resort to paying on the revenue as it's consumed. And maybe doing some sort of bonus up front for at least getting the contract signed. So recognizing the persuasion of that contract signing. And then the last model is your pure pay-as-you-go, no contract. Hey, they just kind of get on board and they start using your product. And so we kind of see that, particularly a lot of companies who have a freemium model, and then they'll, and that might be in their, and then they convert them to kind of a self-service model. In those instances, again, you may just pay on the revenue, but sometimes we'll see companies say, you know what, I want to recognize the rep for getting somebody signed up. And so there's some sort of kind of activation bonus. But anyway, just to kind of share, the right compensation solution will depend on what type of contract you have and what behaviors you're trying to drive. And also, I think it was you, Kaylin, or someone say, how do you keep it simple. So for those companies who have maybe perpetual solutions plus, subscription solutions plus consumption, that is where it gets really, really complicated, because the pure play consumption companies or the pure play SaaS, when you're only focusing on one pricing model, the solution becomes a lot easier. But when you have all these different models and you're already using different, you're already splitting out your target incentive by, say, new business versus renewal, to pull out yet another measure on consumption revenue, it's a very difficult and challenging thing to do.
Yeah, one piece of advice I would give on this, because often the decision to move to consumption is a business unit or a product unit saying we want to do, the product marketing team comes out and says we're going to offer consumption pricing next year, and it kind of just gets thrown into the sales force as something that's an offering that we can now do. It really needs to be, there needs to be some pushback on, okay, so how are we going to operationalize this? How is this going to impact my coverage? How is this going to impact, you need to start thinking about the comp plan as part of the decision to move there, because it will impact potentially the actual pricing model that you pick. It's that critical to the discussion if you want to be successful. And a lot of times, as I said, we're being called by a CRO or somebody in revenue ops to solve for something which is like it wasn't thought about up front when they were deciding how and when they wanted to roll out a new consumption model. I think there was another question that came in, and Rachel, I just want to be cognizant we have like 11 minutes left, and I think we'd love to make this a little bit more flexible and address some of the key questions. Chris, you had mentioned something about talking about the concept of baselines for AEs and when people move around. Maybe if you can just restate the question, then we can try to provide some insight.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Chris?
Can you guys hear me? Sorry, my service cut out. But one of the biggest concepts that we have friction with is the concept of baseline when either paying on usage or set when a rep takes over the account. But and nothing's been paid out, that new rep would inherit that new higher baseline, leaving a delta in amount paid. On how to set baselines that are and achievable, but also fair.
Okay, I think you're cutting in and out, but I think what I'm hearing you say is when you have consumption revenue, how do you set that baseline that's fair, particularly if accounts move from one rep to another, which I know a lot of companies are reshuffling their territories every year. And then particularly with the high turnover that's going on right now, a lot of reshuffling has to happen anyway. One of the things that we've seen a lot of companies invest in is machine learning technology to understand how customers are using their product and leverage that information to therefore then predict their future usage. I know what was it, Microsoft was recently at one of our events, and we had a speaker from Microsoft talking about this and how they've invested a lot in machine learning to help drive predictability in their usage and spend. So if you go down the consumption model, pricing model, definitely investing in those tools to really understand how different cohorts and different types of customers are using your product and using that information to set your quotas. I think
there's a couple other things I would just add. There's two things that can really disrupt consumption model. One is seasonality. And so kind of to Rachel's point, understanding what your seasons are and what you can expect. The other one is the speed at which things typically, what is the speed of growth in the, 6 months in, a year later, a year and a half later, how big should it be based upon what we're seeing historically? And this again comes into some of those learnings. What some of the companies are doing, just as sort of a short-term fix, is if you see on a monthly level that the consumption is bouncing around a lot, then you don't want to use a monthly number to set a baseline. And so you have to really sort of average it out over a bigger period of time. So that could be a quarter or a half year or even a year-long period. So it's a combination of sort of knowing what the patterns are, and then putting the right, putting something that's fair based upon what we think is, an average over the performance period. So the performance period is going to be really critical on this one. There's a lot of modeling that does need to go into this. So this is a hard one to answer, in a specific case over the phone right now.
Yeah. Are you guys seeing people move more to like quarterly or half quotas versus annual, just given the ability to adjust up or down based on discrepancies and kind of unforeseen or windfalls?
Not dramatically. We did during the last year and a half, because of the pandemic, a couple companies did choose to have more frequent performance periods. And let's face it, the tech industry kind of some sectors of the tech industry benefited from the pandemic, particularly collaboration and security. Are hot right now, but predominantly most companies are still kind of sticking with annual quotas. That being said, when companies are going through major transformations, I have one client who just moved to a consumption pricing model from SaaS, and they went to quarterly plan, and their idea was just, let's do this for the year. And then we'll move more to semi-annual or annual again. So yes, I have seen it a few cases, but most companies are still sticking to their annual performance period.
I think it's a good thing to bring up though during the design process. Like it should be considered for sure.
So great question here from Ernie around ideal situation around
quota attainment.
When you do the plan, what do you want to see in terms of those that are kind of above at plan and below plan?
Yeah, really good question. I'll go ahead and do a first pass answer. So we call this participation rate, right? How many people are participating in the upside of the plan? And we would recommend you measure it two ways. One is percent of folks achieving quota, and one is percent of folks achieving target incentive. Because the reason for that is particularly the software industry, what we've seen is a proliferation of add-on bonuses for multi-year, for solutions, for migrations, for new logos, right? So there's so many different ways people can earn their pay. And so we're seeing a delta between those two metrics. So that we definitely would recommend measuring both. While we would recommend that you would have at least, 55 to 60% of your folks achieving quota, particularly your, let's take away your new hires and your rampers. That means your quota is meaningful yet stretched. But what we're seeing in reality, because it's a data point we capture in our database, is it's been hovering around 40%, give or take 5%, depending on what cohort you're in, or sometimes even down to 30% over the last couple of years. So it's been pretty challenging, I think, for sellers to achieve their quota. And that actually may be leading to why some people are jumping ship during this quote unquote great recession that we're seeing.
Yeah. For what it's worth, just
a
thought, just to offer some color. So we measure it. I care about attainment because it leads to retention, right? And so we do two things. One is those making, full 100%, and we run on 6-month plans, which I think is right for at least for our business. Then we also measure those reps that are above 80%, and these are ramped reps, right? Ramp defined is greater than 6 months in chair, which is a little bit below our ramp time. But we are targeting to get to 70% of our reps above 80%, and then obviously continuing to push on the upper bounds of your numbers on 100%.
On 100%.
Yeah. Brandon, I know you have a lot of passion around this because we've discussed it in the past. I think the key here is that while OTE and participating in the OTE upside is important, if you want to keep people, you got to make them sure that they feel confident and they feel proud about what they're doing. And there's a real mental, emotional aspect to this of having winners on your team or people who feel like they're winners. So the fact that the tech industry has dropped from about the mid 50s down to about the 40s over the last 5 or 6 years due to all these other measures that have come in, is one of concern, and I think it's contributed actually to people moving around a lot more. It's one of the contributors to why people are moving around a lot more than they have in the past, and so you're starting to see, attrition rates, shoot above 20%, which is a lot, and it's very expensive for companies to do this. So I think it's a worthwhile thing to say to yourself, maybe we're willing to make the quotas a little less aggressive because we'll get the payback on having people who stick around and feel good about themselves.
Yeah, I also think the other piece is how you manufacture your own talent that you can onboard earlier in career, right, and push from SDR to ISR to corporate or commercial rep and export talent. And we've really over-indexed on investment on enablement so that the teams really believe we're trying to help them build their skills. And that goes a long way psychologically, particularly in COVID when acquisition accounts are difficult, when you can't, get in front of folks. So I do think it's a holistic approach to both problem statements.
All right, well, I'm going to end here. I know we talked about the customer success rep earlier on. I was going to just mention a few things about lead gen and then governance, but I know we're at time. So I'm just going to say if you're interested in reading more of our articles or blogs or participating in any of our community events, feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. And Ted, Randy, Brandon, any other closing comments or?
Good.
I would just say, look, I've used AGI a couple times, and just the credibility that Ted and team bring to the problem statements has been helpful for me to drive transformation faster and educate my bosses on why and how to invest the envelope. So it's been a very good return for what it's worth.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. We really appreciate it. And again, feel free to reach out to us. Either go to the website if you can find something there. But you have Rachel on my email. I think Randy, it's on the deck itself.
Yeah.
Feel free to reach out if you have more questions or you want to have a short conversation. Thanks so much.
And we're going to be posting this for replay so you can share it. Hopefully gives you a great taste of some of the great information. Anyway, Brandon, awesome. Thanks so much. And everybody love it. Comp plan drives behavior. Have a great comp plan. Makes life a lot easier to exceed the, whatever it is, 18-month tenure of CRO life.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, Brandon.